So this course is I guess you'd say it's a kind of history of ideas, specifically philosophical ideas. But a way to think about it, another way to think about it is it's a story of the evolution of human consciousness towards greater and greater understandings of the nature of reality. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And in exploring that, what I'm going to try to do is point out, well, of course, connections to unity, but also some sort of practical dimensions of what is often treated primarily as sort of, I want to say, abstract thinking, abstract ideas. When you think about unity metaphysics, there's a lot of abstract going on there. And at the same time, the seemingly abstract ideas then have sort of immediate connections to our lives when we think about them in certain ways. So I've taught this course before as more of a general audience. So for a general audience, general interest in philosophy, weirdly, if you believe it or not, there is such a thing as that. But I'm adapting a little bit more towards a unity perspective, because this is a unity group, and I can do that. So I'm going to, as I said, begin with I'm going to do some slides as part of this, partly so you don't always have to be looking at my mug, and partly because I just think it's helpful. So, all right, so here we go. I have actually multiple courses. This is part one, being in unity with the universe. So we're talking about trying to get a clear understanding of the nature of reality, I suppose. That's a big topic, and how to align with it. And so you can see there's a we might call it a spiritual dimension to this, right? Because we want to live in alignment with reality as it is. We want to be able to make choices in our thinking and our actions based on the true nature of things, rather than based on illusions or error thoughts. But the discovering of the nature of reality is not quite as simple as maybe a lot of times people think. Okay, what's happening here? Okay, click it. So, starting this week with some pretty big questions. What is reality, right? And that's the domain, in terms of studies, that's the domain of metaphysics. What is reality? So even people who have, theological or religious beliefs, they still have an idea of what is reality, and their concepts of reality are really, in effect, their metaphysics. And excuse me, the same thing is true of people who are, I would call them scientific materialists, who don't really believe that there's anything beyond what we can perceive, and that what we perceive is sort of material or physical reality. That's also a metaphysical position, right? Because a metaphysical position is just what you take it, what your understanding or your belief is about how things work, what things are ultimately, right? So that's one question: what is reality? And the second question: how can we have an optimal experience of life, right? So we don't just want to have, we want to have knowledge, but there's another dimension to this, which is about how to have an optimal experience of life, and that also involves metaphysics and also the area of philosophy that's called ethics. Okay, so what we're going to look at first this week are the early Greek philosophers. This is kind of where all, at least in the Western world, this is where rational thought begins. Okay, and so one of the first questions that comes up is, what is everything made of? Or another way to put it is, what is substance? Right. So this, I'll come back to that question, and as we go through it, we'll look at, what are the ideas of what everything is made of. And here's kind of the thing about asking the question about what is reality. The thing about it is, there are actually a lot of different ideas and opinions and theories about the nature of reality. I've mentioned the materialist view, and you say if whatever a religion a person belongs to, they've kind of got a view. And but to get at this question, what is everything made of? It's really kind of an odd. It's an unusual question. I want to say it's first asked by philosophers, and it's not something that before this philosophical movement began, people hadn't thought about what everything was made of. They thought about who made it, right? And there was always a who, and so it was a god or gods, that sort of thing. Those were the answers they came up with. Who made it? Obviously, it's been made. But the question, what is it made of, is a different sort of question, right? It implies something else beyond just where did it come from or who made it. It's a question about, but what is it actually made of? And that turns out to have some very significant consequences. And then the second question that we'll look at, these two sort of primary questions in this, is what is the nature of the good, the beautiful, and the true? People have a lot of disagreements about what is good. That's the very crux of religious and political arguments. What is the good? We disagree about what is good. And for the most part, we don't even really think about what does the word good mean? Does it actually reference some particular idea or reality? Because this is a question that these philosophers are asking. Same thing with beautiful, and the same thing with the true. So these questions will, answers or thoughts about these questions will continue through the course as we look at different eras, and we'll kind of see how these ideas evolve. But the interesting thing about this era of Greek philosophers is that they came up with most of the basic models of ways that we look at reality. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first slide here, for those who can't see it, it's pictures of religious ideas of reality, in a sense. It's a portrayal, if you will. At the top of the picture, there are a bunch of figures on the clouds. This was like a painting of the gods and goddesses of Greece, right? And so that was sort of the way people visualized the gods and goddesses living up in the clouds, and every once in a while, they had some kind of engagement with human beings. They originally made the world, and then sometimes they got involved in human politics and that sort of thing. This is what's called a mythological perspective. And a lot of times we tend to think, well, when we say something's a myth, we mean it's an error, or it's false, or it's fiction. But that's not really what we're getting at when we specifically talk about mythology. When we talk about mythology basically means storytelling. It's a narrative intended to convey a message. And so we might think that people thought of these gods and goddesses and that sort of thing as in very literal ways. But when we look at the mythology, there's stories about, well, why is there something? And why did these different kinds of things happen? So if you've made a study of Genesis, you're looking at mythology, a narrative that talks about, here's how the world was created, here's where humans came from, why do people fight? That's the story of Cain and Abel, right? Why do we have violence and conflict? That's the story of Cain and Abel. And so kind of all the stories there are intended to express some kind of message, not just an account of facts, but more a message about, with meaning about, in the case of Genesis, the relationship to God, or God's relationship to the world. Well, the other mythologies are the same thing. The primary difference between the biblical mythology, again, a narrative intended to convey a message. The difference between the biblical mythology and the Greeks and the Romans and various other mythologies is primarily that in Judaism, they attributed everything to the one God, right? Whereas in the other mythologies, they had multiple gods representing different things. So that's the primary difference. And yeah, even in Judaism, there was what's called angelology. There are ideas of different angels who have different functions and that sort of thing. So the angels maybe aren't quite the same as Greek gods, but they are certainly spiritual beings who interact with humans in one way or another. So that top picture sort of conveys that mythological view. And then on the bottom right, I also have pictures of statues that were actually made in those times to convey people's ideas of gods and goddesses. And in this particular mythology, all the gods and goddesses are like humans, only perfect. Now, the two pictures, the one at the bottom, the center, and then the one on the bottom left. Bottom left is a depiction of the god Osiris, who is a key figure in Egyptian mythology and their beliefs about the afterlife. Osiris is the one who determines the fate of the soul after death, right? So there's an idea of immortality here. And Osiris, um, after overcoming death, ascended into the heavens. So you see him on a boat. He's got his hand held out in a symbolic gesture of peace, and in his other hand, he's holding a shepherd's crook, showing him as a guide, and then he's surrounded by stars. This is a depiction of him rising up in a heavenly boat into the skies. That's the one on the right, on the left. In the center, there's an early depiction of Jesus's ascension, and I put it in there because you can kind of see the mythological thinking in that picture and how closely it parallels the image of Osiris. Right? Jesus has his right hand extended in the, I'm sorry, that'll actually be his, yeah, that's his right hand, extended in a gesture of peace or blessing. And then in his other hand, he's got a scroll rather than a shepherd's crook, but we're all familiar with the idea of Jesus as the good shepherd. And instead of a boat, he's on some kind of wings of angels or something, lifting him up into the heavens. Instead of being surrounded by stars, he's surrounded by angels. But it's very striking how similar the basic structures of those pictures are, which show kind of a kind of universal or archetypal mythological idea of a savior ascending. So that's kind of the early religious ideas based on stories. What you get in the philosophical tradition is something different. As I said, in the mythological stories, people didn't really think about what is everything made of. They made observations that there were, of course, things like rocks and fire and water and that sort of thing, but they didn't ask the question of what are they made of. So the first person that we know of, at least in the Western world, who asked that question was a philosopher named Thales. And you'll see he lived about 2,600 years ago or so. Thales was from a place called an island called Miletus, which is off the southwest coast of Turkey. And the significance of that just is this was a very prosperous commercial port where there was, of course, a lot of trade of goods that went through there, but also an exchange of ideas. So ideas from Egypt and Babylon and other surrounding areas, the Middle East would sort of be part of the commerce in Miletus. And also people were able to travel by sea to Egypt and Babylon and to Egypt anyway. They were able to travel to Babylon also. So legend has it that Thales learned something about arithmetic, a little bit about geometry in Egypt, and he learned about astrology, which is sort of the ancient form of astronomy, in Babylon. So he had a very inquisitive mind, and he had living in a wealthy area, he had some leisure time to travel and learn and to think. And so he's kind of one of the first mathematicians. He's a scientist. He performed various experiments to find out about things, how things worked. He's usually considered to be the first philosopher. He developed geometry to some extent, to the extent that he was able to calculate the heights of the pyramids using geometry. So it's kind of the first time that mathematical formulas were used to measure something rather than using instruments like measuring sticks and that sort of thing. So that was a contribution that he made to knowledge. from his knowledge of astrology or astronomy, he was able to predict a solar eclipse in 585 BC. So that was a very unusual thing too. People didn't realize that these things were predictable until Thales came along. So Thales asked this really important question, kind of for the first time: what is everything made of? And we can see the importance of that when we think about what knowledge has emerged from asking that question and trying to answer it. That question is the basis of chemistry, of physics, and of metaphysics. All, chemistry, physics, metaphysics, all ask, what is everything made of? What is the substance of things? Now, they arrive at somewhat different answers because of their different methods, but you think about how useful chemistry is and how useful physics is. We in Unity understand how useful metaphysics can be once we understand how to apply it. So we, in fact, in metaphysics, we have a concept of substance. It's a concept of the substance as mind or spiritual energy, right? Those kinds of ideas, which is a little different than the physics concept of what everything is made of. Or at least we might think that's so. By the time we reach the end of this course, we'll see that the modern physicists think more like us metaphysicians on this question than most people do. But most people probably think everything's made of atoms or whatever. But modern physicists don't think that's true at all. And they think it's more like mind. But we'll, as I said, don't want to get too far ahead of the story. But just notice it's a very interesting, and it turns out to be a very fruitful question. Now, Thales, in asking that question, didn't come up with a particularly fruitful answer. He said everything was made of water. Okay, and probably the reason he believed that was, for one thing, he was on an island surrounded by water. And of course, he saw, and most of the people back then thought of the Earth as kind of floating on top of a vast, deep sea of water. Even in Genesis, you read about the waters below the Earth and the waters above the firmament, right? And they thought of the Earth as sort of sitting on and appearing from the waters. And, you know, the Earth is 70% water. Our bodies are what, 90% water, something like that? So water obviously is really important, but it's not what everything is made of. So it was not an unreasonable guess, because you can see water in its liquid, solid, and gaseous forms. It's one of the few, and maybe the only thing that in nature that where we see all those three, we can see all three phases. So that's, you know, probably why Thales came up with that answer. As I said, it wasn't the final answer, but it was a start. It got people thinking about what things were made of. Okay. So the next philosopher came along from the same area was a man named Anaximander. He probably knew Thales and maybe studied with Thales. Anaximander was also a mathematician and a scientist. He was interested in geography, he made maps, and he was also a politician. So he was a very versatile individual. He also believed that everything is in eternal motion, and from that idea, he developed a theory that life was not created in its current form, that it evolved. So here we have 2000, 2,500 years or so, 2,400, whatever, years before the modern scientific view of the evolution of life and the evolution of the universe. We already have this model in the philosophy of Anaximander. So they thought pretty deeply about things, right? These early philosophers. And he looked at Thales' answer and he said, well, that can't be right. It can't be the case that everything is made from some definite thing that we can see. It's not water or earth or air or fire. It's got to be something indefinite. And as things are finite, they have dimensions, physical limitations, the substance of things must not be defined in that way. And so Anaximander concluded that everything comes from the eternal, indefinite, infinite. Okay, well, what would that be? Well, he didn't propose any answer beyond that. But if you think about, well, what is eternal, formless, and infinite, our minds as metaphysicians probably immediately go to the idea of spirit or God, right? And so his idea of substance was an interesting proposal and a step forward that continued through the history of philosophy as different philosophers, metaphysicians thought about what's the nature of substance, especially this idea that it can't have a particular form and that it must, in some sense, be infinite, unlimited. That idea is a recurring idea to talk about the nature of reality. So when we ask this question, what is reality? Part of the question is, what's everything made of? And asking that question can take us away. Take us a ways in coming to an understanding of what things really are. Now, if you took a course in prosperity that used Charles Fillmore's book, you would have read a chapter on substance where he talks about its God energy or God light, that ultimately substance is mind. And he talked about how we can, in effect, shape substance or lay hold of substance through faith. So that's sort of the practical unity metaphysics around the idea of substance. That's in effect it in a nutshell. And so all of our ideas of, for example, using visualization to attract things, that partly involves our notion that things are mind, and somehow our mind is connected to the substance of which all things are made, right? We remember from Hebrews 11, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So that's Anaximander. He's sort of the next one along. There are others who come along proposing that, for example, air is the substance or earth is the substance. And then we come to another philosopher who's pretty interesting for a number of reasons, and that's Heraclitus, sometimes looked at as the sort of the founder of, or at least a inspirer of the Stoic philosophy. He's called the obscure, Heraclitus the obscure, because the way he writes, it's difficult sometimes to understand what it is he's talking about. He sometimes talks in or wrote in paradoxical kinds of sounding ideas. But he was, again, a philosopher of nature. He was observing nature and trying to understand it, but also politics, war, and theology. So now Heraclitus went back to a notion of something definite, but it's also the idea of, he thought everything is fire. And part of his reason for thinking that was because, of course, he knows that fire can consume things. Right, so fire can sort of change things, turn things, or maybe in a way absorb things. But in any case, he thought of everything as constantly changing, constantly in motion. This was his observation. There's no stability, and of course, that observation is similar to Anaximander's notion of eternal motion. Everything's constantly changing. There's a story that I don't know if it's true or not, but a friend of mine told me he read in the Unity archives that Charles Fillmore once said that if he were to rename the movement from unity, the word he would use is change. So maybe he was sort of secretly an admirer of Heraclitus. I don't know. One of the things that Heraclitus said that was sort of famous is that no man ever steps in the same river twice. That's that idea of change. For one thing, the person who, say a person steps into a river and then later comes back and steps into the river, that person has changed. And at the same time, the river has changed because of the constant flow, right? So this goes with his idea of change. And at the same time, Heraclitus said, even though change is constant, it happens in ways that have patterns, that have a degree of predictability. So he thought that all change was harmonized by what he called the logos. The logos is the Greek word for word that we find in the beginning of the Gospel of John. But it's also a word that means reason, that means wisdom, that means to give an account of something. So a lot of our scientific terminology has the word, is partly derived from the word logos. So biology, psychology, the ology words they're using that root word logos to give an account of, for example, the psyche is to do psychology, right? So anyway, this idea of logos becomes very influential in not only in philosophy, but ultimately in Christian theology, as we'll as we'll see, well, as is evidenced by the Gospel of John, but also later theologians talk about the Logos, right? So Heraclitus is an interesting guy. So and another thing that he contributes to the philosophical stream is the idea of reality as a process, an ever-changing process. So as we'll see, when we get to the 20th century, we'll see there's such a thing as process metaphysics. Process metaphysics sort of rejects the idea of any kind of substance and says there's not really an unchanging substance. There's only an ever-changing process. Okay, and that's a fairly influential modern philosophy. But I don't want to jump too far ahead. I'm just trying to foreshadow some things as we go along. Okay, so these are early philosophers who have important ideas that continue to influence Western thought, although they take on new forms as they go along and they become refined. New arguments are attached to them. They're applied to various things. Okay. So Heraclitus says, well, everything's changing, and philosophical types being what they are, they can never accept another person's answer. They have to come up with their own. They have to disagree. That's what makes philosophy and politics and religion interesting, maybe, is this sort of this constant exploration that's never quite satisfied with the previous answers. So Heraclitus said everything's changing. Parmenides comes along and says, no, it's not. Nothing changes. Okay. And what I have on this slide is sort of the essence of his perspective, his argument, if you will, for the idea that nothing ever really changes, right? So the first part of the argument is that everything that can be thought must exist. You couldn't think of it, couldn't have an idea of it if it didn't exist, right? And he then said, we can think of past events, therefore they must still exist. That's sort of the logic here that's going on. And he also concluded that therefore the future must also now exist. So even though we can't remember the past or foresee the future, nevertheless, they are there, that they continue to exist. So this seems like a really sort of weird idea initially, even though the logic of it, as he states it, actually makes a certain amount of sense. It's not an invalid argument per se. But I was reflecting on, what is it that Parmenides could have had in mind here? Or is there sort of modern way we can think about this? And it occurred to me that our notions of time travel sort of fit with Parmenides' view of things, where everything in the past still exists and everything in the future now exists, even though we can't perceive it. So if you think about the notion of time travel, we don't have the technology to do it, but in theory, it's possible. And in fact, in a sense, we see the past every time we look up at a nighttime sky, right? When you see the stars you see in the sky, you're seeing images of stars as they were millions of years ago. You're literally looking millions of years into the past when you look at a star. And if we could travel faster than the speed of light, if we had a technology to do that, we literally could travel into the past, which means the past still exists. I would say, well, what about the future? And I was thinking about that. Well, how would you do time travel into the future? I think what you'd have to do is go into suspended animation, wait for the future to come, then come out of the suspended animation. There you'd be. You would have traveled into the future. Then you get in your time travel machine, go faster than the speed of light, get back to where you were before, and then make your bets on the stock market and the World Series and Super Bowl and that sort of thing, because you gather that information. That's the fantasy. That's one of the fantasies of time travel. But the point that I'm trying to make is it's not completely out of the question that everything that's happened in the past still exists in some sense, and everything that's going to happen in the future in some sense also exists. So there's actually, I read about a theory, I think that was proposed by Stephen Hawking, just sort of a theory of the shape of the universe, that it's actually like a bell. And so the past, the present, future all sort of exist at the same time and continually repeat. We move through the bell. It's kind of a tunnel, a time tunnel. We move through it and we see little bits of it at a time. Does it have a beginning? Not really, because the end is rounded. So we just kind of go around and come back out again on the other side, I guess. So something like that. So if you think Parmenides' ideas are weird, just look at the modern ideas in physics and you'll find something even weirder. So anyway, I think Parmenides, the main reason I like to bring him up is his idea that separation is an illusion, that there's only one eternal being, because that's a metaphysical idea that practically every system of thought acknowledges in one way or another. There's a fundamental unity to the universe. Otherwise, if there weren't a unity to the universe, there could be different laws in different places. There couldn't be, but we know that the same laws apply over in the universe, for example. So it's unified, and if nothing else, by law, but also sort of the fact that just everything's connected, gravitational fields, that sort of thing. So whether you look at terms of physics or metaphysics, an idea of the unity of everything is really fundamental to making sense out of reality. It's all somehow interconnected. Okay, so that's Parmenides. All right. So now we come to one of my favorite philosophers, Pythagoras. We're going back in a sense to what is everything made of, but perhaps maybe even also the question, how is everything formed? I could talk about a long time about Pythagoras, but I'll just try to get through it. He was a mathematician, he was a mystic, he was a musical theorist and a musical therapist. He was a spiritual commune leader. He coined the term philosophers. He's a very interesting guy. His ideas about spiritual community were later adopted by the Essenes and some of the, and I guess the original Christian communities. The idea of holding all property in common. No one had private property. Everyone had access to all the resources of the community. And the community itself was unified by its quest for truth, by its search for the divine. Because what the Pythagoreans did was they contemplated the nature of numbers, and they listened to and created music. And they discovered, one of the things that Pythagoras discovered is that music is mathematical, right? So music theorists know this. I'm not a music theorist, but I'm aware of some terms that come from Pythagoras that reflect this mathematical nature. An octave, for example, is a number 8, an octave. So that's a full range of notes of a particular sequence, right? Particular tones. Harmonics, harmony, harmonic progression, which is also used in mathematics. That term is used there. Maybe if some of you are musicians, you know what a perfect fifth is. I don't remember exactly what it is, but I know that actually comes directly out of Pythagorean music theory. So that's sort of the beginning of music theory. And Pythagoras taught that everything is number. And what he meant by that was that, I suppose part of what he meant was everything was measurable, but I think at a deeper level, what he meant, as far as I can tell, is that all the things that we see and experience are actually rooted in these unchanging truths of mathematics, even regarding the nature of number. He thought primarily of number in terms of ratios, which is where the musical part comes in, and in terms of points or geometry. So when we think about, a shape of something, the shape of something can be measured in mathematical or geometric terms, right? Sometimes it's fairly complicated measurement. So maybe you've heard of fractal geometry, the idea of repeating patterns that we see fractals in nature. Trees are fractal. The branch comes off the tree and imitates the trunk and so on. Or a piece of broccoli, you have the head of broccoli, but then it consists of what? Smaller heads that look the same way, right? So on. So that's the idea of a fractal. So it's mathematical, right? Even though it doesn't initially look like it as obviously as a square, a rectangle, a circle, a sphere, right? That's what he meant. The shapes of things are imitating these, if you will, these divine ideas of numbers and mathematics. And the beauty of that idea is that it recognizes an order and a harmony in the universe that's fundamental to things. Okay, an order and a harmony that's fundamental to things. So when we talk about the idea of divine order, that's sort of what Pythagoras is doing. He's talking about divine order, but he's talking about it in terms of numbers rather than maybe using other kinds of language. And this has turned out to be extremely fruitful perspective when you think about science, because science is really kind of all about mathematics. Physics just are mathematical pictures of the universe. If you studied chemistry, you'd know that every element has an atomic number, referring to the number of protons, electrons, and so on. And the electronic number of the element determines what it can and cannot connect with to make a molecule, and so on, right? And sounds have frequencies, which is basically a mathematical measurement. So it's kind of all math, right? And so this didn't. It took a long time to develop the connection that Pythagoras was talking about, but in our modern era, we can see anyone who studies math, or for that matter, accounting, right, or poetry, right? Poetry has rhythms that iambic pentameter, right, is a name of a poetic form. It's a word that uses it's an idea of number applied to the sounds of words that make up poetry. So very interesting guy. As I said, I could talk about him a lot. I'm going to move on. Another thing you might be interested to know is Pythagoras believed in reincarnation. Okay, so actually many of the ancient Greeks and Romans did, because actually reincarnation was part of their mythological narrative. Homer talks about the process of reincarnation in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And then later the Aeneid talks about the process of reincarnation and what happens. So that was a very firmly rooted belief in the ancient world. Pythagoras thought it was a very important belief, because it's through reincarnation that we can ascend to higher and higher incarnations towards our divinity. So this idea does get picked up in early Christianity, then dropped, and then later picked up again by Unity and some other groups, right? Again, going back to the question, there's one other idea, what is everything made of, that we should mention, and that's Democritus. Again, another mathematician, scientist who was interested in epistemology, nature of knowledge, ethics, that sort of thing. And what he believed that one could get at the truth through inductive reasoning, which is really, in a way, it kind of follows on Pythagoras, because inductive reasoning is just counting stuff and seeing how things fit together. In effect, right? You do statistics, which is inductive reasoning. You're really just making an account of a certain number of cases and what happens in those cases, looking for cause and effect and so on. So that's what Democritus, I guess, contributed, was that emphasis on inductive reasoning, while Parmenides was more deductive, right? And you see how kind of so many modern ideas are already sort of in their seedling state here among these ancient Greeks. And Democritus famously thought that everything is made of atoms moving in the void according to natural laws. So he picks up the idea of natural law and says, okay, this is why they move the way they move, but everything is made of atoms. So now you have an atomic theory, which again is an idea that continues through history, and it's still a very useful idea, because it's used in chemistry. The idea of the model of atoms, anyway, the model of molecules, and then of course quantum physics. They're trying to figure out what's even smaller than the atoms, kind of thing. Sort of looking for what's inside of that, and so on. And Anaximander could have told him, well, you're never going to find the end of it, because the substance is indefinite. It doesn't have a form. So all you can ever do is come up with more smaller forms, but you can't ever find out no matter how small the form gets, there's got to be something inside of it, and that something is substance. It's not the form. So anyway, on and on that sort of debate goes in that perspective. But now we see different viewpoints of reality. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead a little bit more. Have to mention Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I'm just, again, going to kind of go over those a little bit quickly here. Socrates, generally regarded as the most courageous and heroic of philosophers. He stuck to his truth and his quest for truth, even though it offended a lot of powerful people and ended up getting him executed, even even that he accepted as a consequence of, you know, how important this search was. The search was more important than his life. And Socrates believed kind of same kind of things Pythagoras did, reincarnation, but also a kind of afterlife in which you can engage with other people who are interested in what you're interested in. And that was his idea of heaven. Socrates' idea of heaven was, okay, now I get to have discussions with some really smart people of the past, because that was kind of his vocation. He just went around asking questions of people who were supposed to be experts. And that's what got him in trouble ultimately. He kind of made the experts look bad because he kept asking them questions and found out that they didn't actually have the answer. They didn't have answers. They didn't have the answers. He could always find a way to challenge what it was that they were saying. He could always find an exception or a problem with what their proposed descriptions were, for example, of justice. What is justice, right? These are kinds of questions he asked. So he just basically went around having these very guided conversations in which he was continually asking these questions, trying to arrive at some sort of indisputable truth. He was looking for certainty, right? So Socrates, one of the things with Socrates is that since he didn't write anything, we only have the accounts of what he said by the various writers who lived in his time. And they're not always consistent, and it's not always clear which ideas were Socrates and which ideas, for example, were Plato's, his most famous student. So we'll go ahead and jump ahead to Plato's ideas. But the thing about Socrates that he was most interested in the good, the beautiful, and true. How can we lead a good life, an optimally good life? These are the kinds of questions that concerned him. What is beauty really? What is the beautiful? And of course, what is it that is true? So his questions spanned the range of topics from metaphysics, ethics, political science, psychology, and famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's Socrates' contribution, is that he shifts the focus to some extent to the realm of ethics. It's how to be good, but it's also about, and this is the thing we don't always realize about ethics, especially the ancient ethics. We want to know what the good is because we want to know how to be happy. If we find the true good, the true beautiful, that is, and we lead the good, the truly good life, that is where happiness lies. And so that's for Socrates, character is more important than anything else, in a sense, as far as happiness goes. And also, of course, he wants to know what justice is because he wants to know what's kind of the best form of government. So that's where the political science part comes in. Okay, we'll just do this. This one. Well, I got two more slides. Let me stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions before I get into this next little piece here, because I've been talking a lot and pretty fast. So, and I can back the slides up if you want to see another one. So, did anybody have any questions? Just go ahead and speak up.
I did, but I forgot it.
Oh, okay. Well, I understand that. Is there you guys can use the hand raising feature if you know how to use that, just in case you want to interject a question. But I can't see everybody's name at once here. So anybody else, just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up if you do.
I have a question, James. Do you think we could go, because it's so concentrated, we could go like for 15 minutes and then have a question and answer on the material and then go on? What do you think about that? I don't know. Go ahead with what we're doing right now. I just wondered what led to why reincarnation dropped out of the Western philosophy thinking. You have an idea?
Yes. One of this comes down to kind of power politics in the church, really. The objection to reincarnation was it gave people a second chance, a third chance, or more chances to sort of rise up to, I'm going to say, a saved state, or really the idea of an illumined state. And the problem for that, for the church, was they thought that if people thought they had multiple chances to, improve their soul, if you will, that would sort of make the church dispensable, right? Because the church, so for the church, it was better for them to think, people, that you only have this one chance. We're the ones who can get you to heaven. You have to believe what we tell you, and you have to, do the sacraments and all that. You have to follow the church orders in order to get to heaven. Because if you don't do that now, you're going to go to hell. That view was more, they gave them more power, it gave them more authority. And so the idea of reincarnation, somehow they felt, the church leaders felt, made people less reliant on the church and more apt to question the church's authority.
Okay.
So yeah, see, the Greeks, in this era of the Greek philosophers, there's pretty much freedom of thought. There's nobody to tell them you can't think that, because this is the way things are, with the exception of, the obvious exception of Socrates, where the local authorities sort of clamped down on him because he had too many questions. But they didn't kill off all of his, or try to suppress all of his disciples. His disciples just kind of went on and continued to do philosophy. But the church, the church got into a, once the emperor took over, the church got into a real, control mode. And the idea of reincarnation, they felt, was a threat to that. So they then considered it heresy. That's really, that, as far as I can tell, that's what's going on there.
Yes.
Right?
It's interesting that it sort of coincides with the emperor having more influence.
Yes. This is somewhat a different story. It goes into Christian history, but yeah, the emperor is really kind of responsible for the church having a creed, a dogma, a particular set of books that they study, and other sets of books that they don't. That all kind of goes back to, let's have a hierarchy here, with, initially it was the emperor at the top. Eventually in Catholicism, it became the Pope and so on. But that was, yeah, a lot of stuff in the church structures is really about control, certainly not about exploration. This is one of the reasons I actually have a lot more interest in the history of philosophy than I do the history of theology, because history of theology is about how can I make a case for the doctrines that we already believe, whereas philosophy is about what is the truth, and it just keep going at that till you get at it, right? So we don't science, ethics, political science, social sciences all come out of the philosophical stream. They don't come out of the Bible.
Or it's sort of like, what is it we believe and why?
Sorry, what? Say that again, Anna.
What is it we believe and why?
Yeah, that is what theology is about.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And philosophy sometimes, and we get to Plato here, Plato's writings, a lot of times his little stories that he tells, which are kind of fun to read, because they're basically conversation among a bunch of old Greeks, and it tells you a little bit about Greek life, as well as the kinds of things that they talked about for entertainment purposes. There's good character development, all that sort of thing. So it's a little bit more like reading a novel, or at least reading a play, than it is reading what we usually think of as philosophy. But anyway, Plato's dialogues, the point I was going to make was, Plato's dialogues often end without an answer. A question has been raised, answers are proposed, but none of them are satisfactory. And that's not a bad thing. They just kind of determine, okay, we don't know the answer to this yet. But that's reason to carry on continue the conversation, to try to get better and better answers. This little picture here is that you see on the slide, if you can see it, is a famous Plato's famous allegory of the cave that's found in the Republic. It's a kind of a depiction of that, and I won't go into all the details of this, other than to say what the point of it was, that when the world that we perceive with our senses isn't reality. It's a kind of shadow of an imitation of reality, right? So you see the guys holding up the little figures on sticks. They're like they're these guys that are doing a puppet show. The fire represents the sun. The puppet show represents the various opinions that people have about things, and the shadows on the wall represent sense perception. None of that is reality. All of that is an imitation of what's outside of the cave. So I don't know if you can see it on the slide, but there's off to the right, there's a little guy climbing up, kind of climbing up the side of the cave to get out of the hole, to get into the real world. So Plato's point was that the sense world is not the real world, and the world of our opinions is not the real world, but those are all imitations of something eternal and real and divine. The true idea of justice, the true idea of love, the true idea of piety or devotion, the true idea of temperance and courage and so on. Those true ideas, those true forms, and the true forms of the soul are not seen in this world. We have to, through thinking about them and discussing them and contemplating them, we have to rise up out of the cave into the world of the real. So Plato kind of starts, and really probably really does go back to Pythagoras. He starts a contemplative strand in history that leads to mysticism by thinking about contemplating the divine ideas. Sometimes these philosophers would enter into deep meditative states or ecstatic states. And so that sort of turns ultimately into mysticism at the suggestion of this idea that we must contemplate we must contemplate our ideas of beauty, justice, good, truth, and so on in order to, and we must deeply contemplate them in order to experience and truly know them. And so the contemplative life springs out of Pythagoras and Plato and these Greeks. It has much more to do, weirdly, with the philosophical tradition than it does with the biblical tradition per se. They're compatible, but kind of the activities and that sort of thing really comes out of Plato's reality. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, wait, no, I'm not. I'm going to do this. I'm going to skip ahead. Mention a few things that we get from this early period. One is that things that appear are made from things that do not appear. Okay. You do find that idea in the Bible, like in the book of Hebrews. Things that are visible are made from the invisible. Things that appear are made from things that do not appear. True knowledge begins with asking questions and questioning the answers. Opinions are not the same thing as knowledge. That takes a certain amount of courage to keep asking questions, looking at the answers you come up with, and question those, right? But that's, in a way, how you arrive at a deeper and deeper understanding of things. So one of the ways. Another thing we learn mainly from really the Socratic and Platonic tradition is that intuitive knowledge can be evoked by questions and contemplation. That's what Socrates saw himself as doing. He was asking questions. He compared himself to a midwife. He was trying to help people give birth to true ideas by asking them questions. But he also could spend long periods of time in contemplation. This is reported by the people that knew him, where you couldn't disturb him. You couldn't break through because he was so deeply focused. So he was a deep contemplative himself. But he believed that the soul already knows the answers, but it's forgotten it. And so his questions were to help the soul remember. The soul has already seen the realm of forms, the realm of truth and beauty. It already knows at some deep level, but it doesn't remember it. And so the questioning process is to try to bring that memory back up. That's intuitive knowledge, right? We also learned that we can learn a lot from observing nature using inductive and deductive reasoning. And that I didn't really get to Aristotle, but Aristotle really developed the principles of logic that allow us to make true inferences from different kinds of statements and different kinds of information. So a lot of things come out of this, and I realize I'm running a little over. But the things I thought might be interesting to discuss is your idea, is there any practical value in understanding substance, what things are made of? These are different questions, and you can kind of look at them and see if you have any responses to them. What is your current understanding of the good and the beautiful? What do those words really mean for you? Another word you might want to put forward an opinion on or belief is justice. And probably the most important question we can ask, and this again goes to the Socratic tradition of knowing yourself, is what is your opinion of yourself? And what makes you think that opinion is true? So we're sort of questioning what is that we are really? What is it that we are really? So I'm going to stop sharing now and just see. I realize I probably covered more ground than I needed to, but I just get excited and carried away. But I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to anything, any of those questions. You know, what is the good? I don't expect you to tell us what your opinion of yourself is. That may be a thing for personal contemplation to think about. What do you think about yourself, and what is it that, and is what you think really true? And I think that's sort of where the notion of perfection and harmony and order that comes out of the reality of perfection, harmony, and order that comes out of Pythagoras and Plato and some of the others is an important factor to bring in, because we generally think of ourselves as imperfect. But what if you are already perfect just as you are? What does that mean? What is it that you are right now? And how does perfection apply? So those are kind of interesting self-directed questions. But again, I continue to talk when I say I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop now and see what you have to say. Go ahead, Nicole.
I just love where you have taken us with Socrates and Plato. I so desire that we can, as Unity members, meet you actually at Unity Center of Montreal. I love what you've said. I relate to it. I hope you can come to us.
I would love to do that. I would love to do. I've never been to Montreal, so.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
We have
I do not parlez-vous français, but
that doesn't matter. We parlay anglais.
yeah.
Thank
Makes it
you.
possible to communicate for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, Unity's metaphysics is basically Platonic. I mean, in sort of the basic principles, it sort of follows Plato's sense of reality. One of the things I love is there's a chapter in actually the healing power of joy in it's in my book Essential Charles Fillmore, but it's also in Jesus Christ Heals, I think. The healing power of joy. Fillmore talks about Pythagoreanism, in effect. He talks about the whole thing of numbers. So he knew about that as well as, and Charles and Myrtle both, frequently referred to Plato. So they're pretty clearly influenced by his perspective. I'll come back to Aristotle next time we meet, just sort of a place to kick off, because then we can see another perspective.
Good.
Yeah. But what else? I'll ask the question. Do any of you have a sort of preliminary notion of what the good is, what that word means, or what it means to you? I'm not going to question it the way Socrates would. I just want you to sort of put it out there, see what you think at this point. Who I said? Wilma, I think, saw raise her hand, and then Rosemary. Go ahead, Wilma.
Wilma.
Yes, we know that we understand that good comes from the word God. And when I think of the things I read, that God is all there is, your thoughts, if you've got some thoughts that you yourself believe are not the right thoughts, and you try to make them right by changing them, then that is partly my idea of what is good.
Okay, so to be good is to be divine, in effect, right? It's so the ultimate and only good is God. That sort of idea is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah. I saw Rosemary, and I know Catherine's got, she looks like Catherine might want to say.
So-
Go ahead, Rosemary. I think I saw you next up.
For me, good, the more people that I meet from different cultures and different places, the more I become aware that all of us want good. We may not be sure of what it is,
Yeah,
or we may not agree on what it is, but that's really what everybody is seeking, is what to them seems good. And the other thing is that what we think is going to be really good doesn't necessarily feel that way when you get it.
uh-huh. Yeah, that's a really good insight, because I mean, in a sense, that's what all these old philosophers were up to. They recognized people had different ideas of the good or justice and so on and so forth. So if we all have these ideas, even though we disagree, there must be something behind them that's real and true. And that's what they were kind of looking for. And it's not an easy thing to find or convince
that's-
people of, for that
That's
matter.
where Plato's analogy was so brilliant, because it really describes that experience, which I think everybody has probably had at some point.
Yeah, what's your experience? I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
We cannot hear you, Rosemary. You have to speak into the mic.
Okay. That made me, what you said made me think back to Plato's analogy, which really does describe the illusion versus the reality, and how hard it is really to be in touch with what is real,
Yeah,
the amount
yeah,
of effort that it involves
yeah,
for
I agree.
everybody.
Good point. Thank you. Catherine.
Yeah, well, I don't know. When you said, like, who are we? And my idea of who we are, according to the things I've read and studied, are that we are divine children of God. We are points of awareness in the mind of God. And I think I associate good with authentic, like that's what we're striving for, is to leave behind superficiality and live from a place of authenticity in all of how we think and how we act and how we speak. And I don't know if that has anything to do with what you've been talking about.
That is a very philosophical thing to say, Catherine, because
No.
that's the philosophers were very often, they were being true to their own thought, and sometimes
Mhm.
that the great ones, it would put them at odds with their culture and the prevailing beliefs. It obviously it killed Socrates. Most of the philosophers were much more lucky than he was in that respect, in terms of being able to express their truths, but they were being authentic to what they really believed, and that authenticity is connected to other ideas of virtues, such as having integrity, being
Yeah.
honest, right? So that's at least part of a lot of what a lot of our ideas of good. And I think one of the interesting things is that it's probably easier to name a bunch of good qualities than it is to say what it is that they all have in common. So that's kind of
Right.
part of the challenge. What's justice
Yeah.
have in common with compassion? Courage. What does courage have to do with temperance? Right?
Yeah.
They're all good. Why? What's the common ground? So that's interesting thing.
Yeah, great.
Who else? Oh, other hands. Wait. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say thank you. This was a great hour.
Oh, good. Good. I'm glad you're getting something out of it. I see hands up. Yay. Okay. So I'm not sure who was first. I'll go with Anna and then Elise. Go ahead, Anna.
Okay, thank you. I mean, what came to me instinctively or immediately when you see, what is good was wholeness.
Okay.
And I also was just reflecting. I thought, wow, ask me, a year from now or 5 years from now, what my idea of good is, and I'd be interested to see what I say, you know.
Uh-huh. Right? Because you might, maybe I'll ask again next week and see if anybody's changed their mind. But an interesting connection of your idea is that a lot of these, going back to really, so again, Pythagoras and Plato, but pretty much throughout the history, what you see, that idea of oneness, which, and the idea of perfection are related to the idea of wholeness. To be, one of the meanings of perfect is complete, right? One of the meanings of unity is to be in, for parts to be in order, to have their integrity. So these, we could seek some of the connections, you know, and I think that's a good place to kind of start, and sort of go towards.
It's almost like trying to understand God with your human mind, and that starts to hurt, you know.
Yeah, yeah. It's like I say, we can understand the concept of infinity, but we can't comprehend infinity. I cannot count to infinity, but I know what the word means. It means an unending series, right? So there's that difference between understanding a concept and truly, fully comprehending it. And
Getting it. I work with kids, and I was wearing an infinity necklace, and one of them asked me, "Oh, what is that? What does that mean?" And I said, "Well, there's no beginning and there's no end." And there was silence. Like there was no sort of, "Oh yeah, okay." It was just like, well, next question. You know?
That's, yeah, it's one of those, another incomprehensible concept is eternity, which is out of time, because we think in terms of time, but eternity really means not time in a sense. Go ahead, Elise. Your arm must be tired from having it up for so long, Elise, so you go ahead.
That's okay. The question you ask, what is who am I and what is my opinion of myself? And so in a very like basic way, I could say that what I am is like the result of 38 years of physical and biological and environmental influences conditioning me.
You broke up there a little bit, Elise. I don't know if that's my
And what and my opinion, oh no, it says my is unstable.
Oh yeah,
I don't
have
know.
that problem sometimes too. But you said something about
yeah. So
oh, you're a product of your 38 years
yeah.
of biological
and
evolution.
and the opinion I have of myself is also the product of that. So it's like the cave we're in, and the story goes that it's not the person in the cave that freed himself. It's someone from the outside that came and took the person out. So what is the good? I think it's all those things. We're English is not my first language, so sometimes it's hard to express what's in my mind, but like
your English is better than my French, so don't worry about it.
So if I'm the result of these processes, and my opinion is also the result of these processes, I cannot change that myself all alone. I cannot change. I'm in the cave, so I need outside help. May it be divine grace or a fellowship or all these things, that these moments in your life that it's beautiful, it's good, it's everything seems clear, and that veers you on somewhere completely different that where you were going before. And so that is why I think the good is, it's like whatever comes into our life, and it's not us that decided, it just came like this, and it brought us off of a cage and of the cave and made us rethink and redefine who we are. I hope it makes sense what I say, but
it does. Yeah, it
absolutely. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's so we're all kind of looking for a midwife like Socrates who can help us find out what's within us.
Right. Yeah.
That can help draw that out of us. I think it's a sort of part of what you're saying, or related to what you're saying, I guess is maybe a way to put it. Sharifa, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, you asked us about the meaning of good. And to me, I interpret that as having a reference for all life. And the other thing I wanted to say is, when you were talking about all the philosophers, I didn't hear anything about astrology. I thought some of them were astrologers.
Oh, yeah, because that's I'm kind of, because I can't cover everything anywhere near. So I'm just focusing on mainly on metaphysics and ethics, those areas. Astrology turned into astronomy, so it's kind of more science. So the only sort of reference I made was the part about Thales predicting the eclipse. He used his knowledge of astrology, as it was called then, to do that prediction. The word astrology really means to have an account of the stars, in the same way that the word psychology means to have an account of the psyche or of the soul. So astrology, the modern astronomers would have actually preferred that term, but it was already taken and associated with other things. But the astrologers, the original astrologers, were what we would call today astronomers. It's just they gave more significance for human life or whatever, to the formations of constellations and planets moving through constellations and where the sun was and that sort of thing. They gave more meaning to that, whereas a modern astronomer just kind of wants to know where things are positioned and how big they are and how hot they are and what their gravitational field is, and those sorts of measurable things. They don't get into the qualitative aspect of it.
Okay.
Yeah, but you know, Pythagoras with his numbers, in a way, he was a little bit like a numerologist, because he believed that numbers had definite qualities or properties that he associated with them, like a numerologist does. So it's sort of interesting, because we want meaning as human beings. We don't want to just know facts and measurements. We want, what does that mean? What does it mean in a big sense? What does it mean in my life? Whatever it is. And so those two fields eventually sort of drifted apart. So astrology became astronomy. Numerology became mathematics, and the two sort of went their separate ways for people with the separate questions, I suppose, the separate interests. But yeah, it was a good point. I'm probably not going to talk much about astrology, though, to be honest.
Okay.
Just don't have time. Feel free to interject any astrological knowledge that you may have that seems relevant to the discussion.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Maya, did you have something?
Well, I just want to, it struck me, you used the word midwife, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking about, I always feel so grateful to Unity for not defining too many things, not to be too dogmatic, not to be too defined, and always saying, well, let the process reveal to you what you believe. And I'm thinking about this whole concept about staying with the question. You know, you mentioned several of these people who are inviting to stay with the question. And I'm thinking about the midwives, although they are helping a baby to be born, but they're very aware that they only can allow, facilitate nature to reveal itself and to do its thing, right? They cannot birth the baby. The body, the nature has to birth. And I was thinking about the midwife as a metaphor for this kind of always going deeper, always asking the question, never allowing ourselves to come and thinking we know what metaphysics is the final answer, or that unity has the final answer, but to stay mindful with the open question. That's it.
Yeah, the word maieutic is from the Greek word for midwife. So we talk about maieutic education. They're really talking about following the tradition of Socrates of drawing out what's within the students, right? That's an interesting development that tickled me when that became like a popular term in education. Maieutic.
Right.
Socrates is way ahead of you guys. Come on.
Well, would you like us to close and have a closing prayer, or would you like to continue, James?
Well, my understanding was originally this was to be an hour class. I've already gone an hour and 21 minutes because
I know.
I talk too much.
It's okay. No, I just wanted to have a moment to have a closing prayer, but also to remind everybody to send in your love offering, which is part of our circle of giving and receiving. Please be mindful. And if you have any closing words, James, otherwise we'll have a prayer for protection. Anybody? Yes, James, go.
I think the prayer for protection would be perfectly appropriate. Let's do that.
Okay. We usually reach across the screen, touching each other, and we're saying the prayer for protection together. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us.
The power
of God protects
watches
us,
over us.
and the presence of God watches over us wherever we are. God is, and all is well. And thank you very much, James. Till next week.
Yeah, see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We had 14 people on the screen. Hallelujah. Bye. Bye.
Bye,
everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Enjoy that. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. Bye.
Dr. Meyer,
Yes, Wilma.
can you give me 4 minutes of your time before you?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm all yours.
Yes. I spoke with Janet 2 days ago.
Yes.
And well, I saw the form that was sent and she signed, but I asked her, I said, well, did you sign the form as yet? And she said no. And I only got to talk to Keziah today. And I told her I noticed that Janet had signed the form even though she said no. But Keziah thinks, as you see from her email, that Janet has signed, and then you take it from there and you send it in. If you read her email.
Yeah, I know, but that's she has the surrender documentation has to come from Janet. It's not ours, you see. We are only the beneficiary.
Yes.
And we are getting billed now. We are now getting billed by Canada.
Oh.
And it says if you don't pay, you're going to default on the policy. Well, fine. Because now that Janet has told them she's not she's not paying anymore, they're falling on us to pay. And we are, the letter has to come from Janet that she's surrendering the policy.
I thought that maybe you might want to talk to, because if you notice, what she said to me today is she's quite willing to send it in if that is what it means. So yeah. I thought that maybe you can send her another email.
Yeah.
Letting her know that they are the ones to send that form into Canada Life, print it, as you said, and send it in to them. I told I was going to speak to you this evening, and one way or the other, I when once all is said and done, I definitely would get in touch to make sure everything's okay.
Yes. No, I very much appreciate that. And we got a letter. I talked to Susan. I talk with her once a week about the, checks coming in and deposits. And she said, there's a letter here from Canada Life telling us if we don't make the payment, we're going to default on the policy. Well, we're not going to make any payments to them.
No. Oh, no, not at all.
So, we are already being told that we are defaulting. Well, I called them, as I told you a few weeks ago. I told them we're not making any payments.
No.
And Janet has already announced to them she's not making any more payments, and the surrender document is being taken to Janet to sign and then sent to them. I'll call Cassia. Okay, yeah, I'll do that.
Yes, and I think we're right. If it defaults, let it default, because it makes no sense for us to pay it. No sense at all. They got enough money. They got enough.
Oh God, yes.
Yes, they got enough.
I mean, we are so in agreement with this. Absolutely.
Yes.
Now I'm going to send you the biography on Lisa.
That was the other thing I meant to ask you.
For Sunday, and I asked to update it with the information of what she's doing with us in Unity and her classes she's taking with us and all that. And I'll send it to you tomorrow morning, and then you have that to present to the congregation. She's right. Okay.
Have a good evening. Right. Bye-bye.
Love you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.